they wish. So hello to you all. I am a physicist who has been involved with lasers since 1829, before all you guys were all born. So I'm really old now, as you can see. Look at that. So I'm going to talk today a little bit about the fundamentals of lasers and IPLs and how they relate to hair removal and how we choose the right settings, because choosing the right settings is probably the trickiest part. And when I'm talking to trainees about this, this is the one that always gets people confused. So I'll tell you a little bit about how to do this. I mean, I can't go into any great detail today, but I'll give you a good introduction how it all starts. All right. So first things first, let's get back to basics, because a lot of people don't even understand the basics. So let's do that. Now, this is being recorded and it's also going to be available as a PDF, which I'll post up. So don't be scribbling furiously, because there's nothing worse than watching women scribbling furiously. Honest to God. Right. So the first thing, wavelength. Hold on. Do I need to keep admitting? Oh, I do. Yeah. Okay. Wavelength. What's wavelength? Wavelength is just color. That's all it is. Whoops. It's just the color of light, which is important when we're talking. We're going to talk about fluence and the importance of that. Why fluence is so important? The pulse width. What is pulse width? Who knows? And then repetition rates, which people kind of get hung up on, but really shouldn't. And then denaturation, which is just a fancy way of saying cooking. So anybody who's boiled an egg or fried bacon or a sausage, or I don't want to upset all the vegan people out there, but you know, all that kind of thing, then I'm going to talk about what that actually. Oh, that was a bit weird. Oh, wavelength. Wavelength is just color of light. That's all it is. We need to choose the wavelength depending on what you want to treat. So 532, for example, which we use with Q-switch YAG lasers, that's green, nice bright green color, lovely. 755 is a deep red color. This is what we get from the Alexandrite laser. 808 or 810 is near infrared. It's invisible. You can't see that. We use that for hair. And then 1064 we use for tattoos and hair as well. And it's also near infrared and also invisible. So you can't see. You'll never see 1064 or 810. It's just impossible. Weird eyes. Who knows? But the two important things that we need to understand. Oh, mute. Is how far light penetrates into the skin. With technical. Weird. Oh. Sorry guys, just trying to get rid of this noise. How far does the light penetrate into the skin? And the wavelength determines that. And then once the light has got into the skin, how much of that light is going to be absorbed by the melanin in the hair? Because that's what we're trying to do. You're trying to get this energy into the hair so it heats up and then hopefully destroys it. Then we've got fluence, or energy density, which a lot of people call joules. And this is just the concentration of energy. So you pull the trigger on your machine and it fires out a whole bunch of energy, and you're going to know how concentrated it is, because if it's a high concentration, it will generate high temperatures in the skin. If it's a low concentration, it'll generate low temperatures, which might not do the trick. You might be wasting your time then. And in actual fact, a lot of people out there using this kind of equipment, a lot of them, they do use low fluences and therefore get pretty poor results, sadly. So the fluence is very important in determining whether you're going to get successful results or not. Pulse width. This is the pulse length or the pulse duration, just how long the pulse is on for, often quoted as ms or milliseconds. This is the cooking time, all right? If you say you're going to boil an egg, you stick on a pan of water onto your cooker, and the water's bubbling away quite happily, and you put the egg in for 30 seconds and then take it out, it's not going to be cooked because the pulse is too short. The pulse width for that, for an egg, is about 3.5 minutes or 4 minutes or whatever. So you've got to make sure that you get the temperature right, and then you've got to make sure that you're cooking it for the right length of time. You've got to get both of those correct, otherwise it ain't going to work. The bottom line appears to be that longer pulses will generate more success. And I'll discuss that a wee bit more later. Then we get repetition rates, or the hertz. And this is just how quickly the shots are fired every second. So you might have a machine that can fire 2 or 3 hertz, or 2 shots a second. That's quite slow. Or you can get some machines, some lasers now, that can go up to 10, 15, 20 shots per second. Now, in actual fact, in most instances, the hertz doesn't really make a big difference in terms of the actual treatments. Although it can cause problems if it's not set up correctly. So we've got to be a little bit careful about this, but it's not really so important in terms of the treatment result like fluence and pulse width and wavelengths are. And then we've got denaturation. So if I ask you all, hands up, how many of you guys have performed denaturation? You probably think, don't know. But the answer is you all have, because denaturation is just a fancy way of saying cooking. That's all it is. So when you cook sausages or eggs or bake a cake, then what you're doing is you're denaturing the proteins. That's the actual, that's the chemistry that's going on there. For hairs, what you must do is you've got to cook all the germ cells around the follicles, because it's the germ cells that basically generate an anagen phase follicle. If you can kill all the germ cells, then the follicle dies and the hair cannot come back. But to do that, you've got to get the right temperature of the germ cells, which is determined by the fluence, and the right time, cooking time, which is determined by the pulse width. So you've got to get both these guys correct to make sure you cook properly. There's no point sticking your cake in the oven for 20 minutes and pull it out after that, because it won't be cooked, as we all know. So here is denaturation in practice. So I set up I used to be on MasterChef years ago. I won it. I was just the bestest chef ever. Yeah, I believe that, you believe anything. But I can fry an egg, just about. So here's an egg. So you set the egg in, a little bit of warm out, and look what happens right away, the white of the egg turns. Oh, what's yeah, I just uncooked it. So you can see the white of the egg turns white, because what's happening is proteins break down. That's part of the denaturation process. And you can see that the yolk of the egg, the yellow bit, is still uncooked. Because it takes longer. Even though you've got it at the same temperature, it just takes longer than the white of the egg. And this is kind of what happens in the skin as well. We have different things happening at different speeds in the skin. And it's kind of tricky then to figure out exactly what to do and how to do it. It's quite tricky, as I say. You stabbing the egg. You can see that after a couple of minutes, a lot of it is denatured. I think still some of it, you can still see some of the white of the egg there is still not cooked. And that's because the white of the egg below it is acting a bit like an insulator, so that it's not getting as hot. So it takes a bit longer. That's why you tend to flip eggs over when you're cooking them, so that they cook on both sides. So this egg ended up like this. That was a before shot, and that was the after shot. I know how you all love befores and afters, and it was delicious, if I say so myself. So denaturation is basically cooking, and like eggs, what we're trying to do is cook the hair. You've got to cook the hair and the germ cells, stem cells, whatever, to completely destroy them. And if you do that, then you get a good result. You'll kill the follicles. But this depends on the temperature and the time. It seems to me that from talking to a lot of people out there, it seems that a lot of people don't really get that. They're told quite often to talk about fluence and temperature, but they don't really discuss the timing aspect, which is really important. And then you've got the hair growth stages. So we all know that hair grows through anagen, catagen, telogen, and then back into anagen. And unfortunately, light-based treatments like lasers and IPLs, they only work in the anagen phase. This is when the germ cells are actively generating a new hair. So we can only kill the hairs when they're in anagen. Unfortunately, though, we never know when they're in anagen. It's impossible to tell, or very, very difficult to tell. So it's a bit of a hit and miss. Now, I see a lot of things online which are a bit annoying, but they're comparing lasers and IPLs. They say, oh, IPL is rubbish and laser is much better and what have you. And it's not true. If you fire a laser, imagine this is a beam of lovely red laser energy, you fire at the skin, and when it goes into the skin, the beam will spread out like this, because that's just what happens. As soon as the light hits the atoms and the molecules in the skin, they start to scatter all over the place and they just spread out. So as you get deeper into the skin, the beam spreads out, and whatever fluence you had at the surface drops as you get deeper and deeper into the skin. That's just the way of the physics. You can't change that. But an IPL is slightly different. IPL's got multicolored lights, unlike lasers. Laser only has one color. And the difference here is that when that goes into the skin, it also spreads out. But what you'll find is that the red light will go deeper than the yellow, which is deeper than the green, which is deeper than the blue. So the different wavelengths penetrate differently into the skin. And we can see it like this. This is a cross-section of the skin. The blue light you can see here doesn't get very deep at all. It just basically gets to the bottom of the epidermis, which is only about a tenth of a millimeter thick. It's not thick at all. Green light can get a little bit deeper into the skin, so you can treat very superficial blood vessels. Yellow light can get a little bit deeper again, but red light penetrates the deepest, and infrared even a little bit deeper. So you can see here that the wavelength is really important in terms of your target. If you've got a deep target, like a hair follicle, there's no point trying to use blue or green or yellow light, because the energy just can't get down to the germ cells in the follicle. You have to use red light for that. Likewise, if you wanted to treat something that was very superficial, like freckles, for example, then you could use blue or green light to do that, because you don't need energy to go deep into the skin, because they're not deep. So choosing the wavelength is important depending on where your target is, how deep the target is. The diode laser is about there somewhere, about 8-10 nanometers. So it's a nice kind of reddish infrared color. And the YAG's a little bit longer than that. So then there's a contrast. The contrast between the hair and the skin is really important, okay? If you've got high contrast, so the hair is dark and the skin is pale, then you're going to get more absorption in the hair and less in the epidermis, because the dark hair, the melanin in the dark hair will attract or absorb more of the light energy than the epidermis. However, if you have a low contrast, so you've got light hair and a darker skin, then there's less absorption in the hair and more in the epidermis. So that means you're going to have more chance of blistering and pain and screaming abdabs and all the rest of it. So the contrast is really important. There's no point, well, you could treat light hair and dark skin, but you're going to have more difficulties. It will cause you more problems. Dark hair on pale skin is always the best option for all light-based treatments, regardless of which laser you're using. And then skin color. What is skin color? Well, basically, it's just the epidermal melanin content. The more melanin you have, the darker the skin is. And the way this works is, the darker the skin, the higher the temperature you're going to generate in the epidermis, because that's where a lot of the melanin is, and therefore the more potential damage in the epidermis and more blistering. So you've got to be careful that with darker skins, you run a higher risk of damaging the epidermis and causing blistering and more pain, etc. So keep that in mind always, and that's with all the visible lasers. Once you start to get up to the infrared lasers, so the diodes and the YAG lasers, then that risk of that reduces, because they're not so strongly absorbed in the epidermis. So what happens when you heat a hair? So here's a wee cross section of a hair. What we're trying to treat is these guys here, the germ cells, the stem cells, the green stuff here, because they're the cells that generate the anagen phase of the follicle. Unfortunately, though, we can't target those cells directly. There's no There's no chromophore in there to target. So we have to use the chromophore in the hair itself, which is the melanin. So to do this properly, you cool the skin above to protect the upper layers and the epidermis. You then fire in your red lights. It scatters about all over the place, and some of it is absorbed. A tiny fraction, actually, not very much, is absorbed in the melanin. And then the melanin heats up and the heat expands out into the surrounding areas. Now, if you get enough heat and you get enough time, then it will heat up the germ cells and hopefully cook them, denature them, which is what we're trying to do. But if you haven't got enough of either the energy or the time, then you're going to have a little bit of these cells remaining alive. They'll survive the treatment. And if you keep some of these cells alive, they will regenerate and you'll get a new hair at some point later on. And these hairs inevitably come back as finer, thinner hairs, which are more difficult to kill. So a lot of people out there, I hear this all the time, people saying, well, I'm treating my clients and then they come back after a few weeks and the hairs come back finer. And this is why, because you haven't killed all the germ cells. So the follicles haven't been completely destroyed and they come back with thinner hairs. And thinner hairs are harder to kill. They just are, sadly. So there are two main times we have to think about when you're targeting hair. The first one is the time for the heat to conduct out. So you're heating up this thin hair, which is full of melanin, and the heat then expands outwards or conducts outwards into the surrounding areas. That takes a certain amount of time. And then you've got another time to consider, which is the cooking time. Like I said before, if you're boiling an egg for 10 seconds, it's nowhere near enough. You've got to make sure you cook it for a long enough time. And it's the same with these germ cells. So what we have to do is make sure that our pulse width that we choose in the machine, laser or IPL, effectively covers both of these times. So that tells us that longer pulse widths are better. A longer pulse width will allow more time for the heat to conduct out to the germ cells and then for the germ cells to actually cook properly. Short pulse widths really don't hack it, I'm afraid, and especially for thin hairs. So the energy or the fluids is what determines the cooking temperature, and the pulse width is what determines the cooking time. And you've got to get both of these right to make sure you're successful. If you get one of these wrong, you'll be struggling. You really will. So how does thick and thin hair, how do these guys compare? Because obviously we've got all sorts of hair thicknesses when clients come for treatments. Well, thin hair, if you treat a thin hair, it can become very hot. They can absorb some of the energy and become quite toasty. But they cool down rapidly because small things or thin objects do cool quickly compared to thicker things. And therefore there might not be enough time for full denaturation of the germ cells, just because they're cooling so quickly. And then for thick hairs, well, they don't get as hot as a thin hair for the same energy because there's a lot more material to heat up. So as a consequence, the temperature doesn't go as high as with a thin hair. But they cool down more slowly because they're thicker. So you've got thick hair that might be a little bit cooler than the thin hair, but it cools slowly. And again, there might not be enough time for the denaturation process because if the temperature is lower, you need more time. Imagine trying to bake a cake at 100 degrees instead of 180 degrees. Well, you can still bake it, but it would take twice as long, near enough. And it's the same with hair. Thick hair and thin hairs take different times and different temperatures. So it's quite confusing. How do we get around this? Well, if you've got a deep follicle, you need to increase the fluids at the surface because you're trying to target the germ cells and the melanin, which are deeper in the skin. So you've got to get a lot of energy down there to create the temperature. If you've got a large follicle, so the hair is quite thick, you need to increase the pulse to make sure you get enough cooking time, because otherwise you're going to leave some of the germ cells alive at the end of the pulse. If you've got a thin hair, again, you have to increase the pulse because even though the temperature is quite high, it cools quickly. So you've got to make sure you keep the temperature up for a long enough time to cook those hairs as well. Kind of curious that the answer to thick and thin hairs is the same: increase the pulse, assuming you get the right temperature. If you've got light colored hair, and by that I mean brown or light brown, but not any lighter than that, then you have to increase the energy of the fluence because there's less target there, there's less melanin. So you've got to force in more energy to make sure you get the right temperature. And if you've got a darker skin, then you want to make sure that you're protecting the epidermis by pre-cooling the skin before you fire the pulse. So it's quite complicated sequence here, depending on the hairs and the follicles and the depths and the thicknesses and all the rest of it. It's a bit of a minefield, which is why I'm telling you all this just now. So for dark hair, here's the numbers. Here's the groovy stuff. For dark hair, black or dark brown hair, I recommend typically we want to use pulses between about 30 and 70 milliseconds with a fluence somewhere between 20 to 35 joules per square centimeter. Now, it's quite a wide range here of both of these because it depends on where the hair is, how deep it is, what the color is, and the thickness of the hair. So it has to be quite a wide range. Single numbers just don't do it. And if the hair's a lighter brown color, again, don't go for blonde or red or silver fox like this. It doesn't work, not enough melanin. Then you might need to use slightly longer pulses, maybe up to 100 milliseconds in some cases, and higher fluences, 25 to 40 joules per square centimeter. So if you use these sorts of parameters, then you should be able to cook the germ cells in the hairs that you're targeting, hopefully. I personally always start with 2020. That's my vision. A 20 joule per square centimeter fluence and a 20 millisecond pulse width. And I got to say that I think that's low, but it's a good starting point because I know I'm not going to damage anything. Now, I often see, all the time I see this, I see people who've got machines and they're told, yeah, use a fluence of 10 or 11 or 12. And I hear this and I think, you're wasting your time because all you're going to do is just tickle the follicles. You're going to kill some of the germ cells, but a lot of them are going to survive because you're not cooking them. And the pulse widths can be anywhere from 5 to 10 to 15 milliseconds. And again, not enough time to cook them. Honestly, it's as simple as that. Just think of it in terms of cooking. You want to boil an egg, you set the pan to bubbling water, so it's 100 degrees, and you cook it for 3.5 minutes or 4 minutes. But you're not going to boil it for 2 minutes or 1 minute because you know yourself, it just doesn't work. And it's exactly the same with hair and the germ cells. So the success, how do you improve your success rate with these treatments? Well, it works like this. Basically, the higher the fluence, the higher the success. It's as straightforward as that. But if you use a low fluence, you're going to be in a safe zone because you're not really going to be doing any significant damage. But once you get into the higher fluences, then you're in a danger zone because you could start to damage other tissues as well. So you could start to cook the collagen and the blood vessels and the nerve tissue, etc. So when you're in the high fluence area, like here, in the danger zone, there's a much greater risk of damage to other tissues that you don't want to damage. Because what you're trying to do here is you're trying to just damage the target. So that's the hair follicles, without damaging all the stuff around it. And that's a bit of a fine line. So to mitigate against this risk, we have to use proper cooling. If you don't have good cooling, you're just going to cook everything, which you don't want to do. Cooling is critical, absolutely critical. I did a calculation on this a couple of years back, and I found that every time you pull the trigger and you fire all this light energy into the skin, more than 90% of that energy is not doing the job that you are hoping. In other words, it's not cooking the follicles, it's trying to cook something else. And unfortunately, the way things work is that that energy is kind of stuck in the skin unless you give it a route to get out. So you've got to use a cooling route on the skin surface. Use cold gel and ice packs and whatever to make sure you draw out all that excess heat. If you don't do that, the heat energy will be stuck in the skin and it will just keep cooking stuff. Stuff that you don't want to cook. So cooling also reduces the pain because if you cool the skin surface, you reduce the temperature of the pain sensors. You can reduce it by 10, 15 degrees or something like that. And then when you hit the skin with the laser energy or the IPL energy, they're much cooler, so they're less likely to trigger. So it's, you take away a lot of the pain sensation. There's less chance of epidermal damage because you're not cooking the melanin in the epidermis as much. Less chance of blistering. Nobody likes a blister. And you get happier clients. So cooling is just a good idea all around. I mean, the way to look at it is, if you're throwing in all this energy into the skin, then what you're trying to do is you're purposely trying to burn something. That's really what we're doing here. You're purposely trying to burn the germ cells in the follicles. So you've got to mitigate against burning everything else by applying proper cooling as well to balance it. It's a balancing act, okay? And then placement. How often do you see this? People using diode lasers or IPLs, and they do this really kind of bizarre pattern of shots on the skin, and there's big gaps in their funny directions. And oh my God, it makes me weep. What you want to do is this. I mean, it's kind of obvious, isn't it? You want to get a nice, consistent placement of the shots, close together, but not overlapping. Overlapping is not good because it can overheat those areas. In some sort of a kind of a grid formation. Now, some people I know do use a grid, which is great, but a lot of people actually don't. They use this thing on the left, which is just a bizarre, random collection of funny shapes. So please try and make sure your placement on the skin is consistent. And you'll just get better results. There's no doubt about it. They're much it's much more regular than the patchy stuff on the left. Hair growth cycles. Here's the groovy stuff. About 2 or 3 decades ago, or even more now, there was some work done by some scientists. They looked at the growth cycles across the body, upper lip and the arms and the armpits, etc. And they looked to measure the anagen, catagen, and telogen phases. So I've kind of summarized some of that information here. But you can see there's quite a wide variation. The upper lip, the total growth cycle for the upper lip is about 16 weeks. For the arms, the armpits, and the bikini, they're all about 30 weeks. Legs is 38 weeks, and the chin is 64 weeks. How bizarre is that? Your chin hairs just keep growing forever. So 52 weeks of anagen in the chin, which is bizarre. So this is a little diagram I put together that just shows that this is the weeks, 1, 2, 3, blah, blah. So there's your upper lip there. You can see it's quite short, and then the arms and the armpits and that. And then there's the legs, and let's get rid of this. Legs are quite a long time. The chin just goes way down off the bottom of the page. So the growth cycle across the body varies enormously. It just does, and there's not an awful lot we can do about it. That's the reality of it. The anagen phases, as you can see here, range from 8 to 12 to 16, 16, 52 for the chin. So how do we know when the hairs are an anagen? Because we can only kill follicles when they're an anagen. How do we know? Well, the reality is we don't. It's impossible to predict these things. This is some of the data that these guys generated. So you can see that you've got the chin, upper lip, axilla, that's your armpits, bikini area, legs, etc. So you can see the duration of anagen, telogen, percentage, and your chin, 81% of your hairs are in anagen at any one time. Only 16 are in telogen. On the upper lip, anywhere between 43 to 71%, because it's quite a long. I don't know why there's so much variation between some of the hairs on the upper lips. But so quite a lot of the hairs are in anagen at any one time, and a chunk of them in telogen. And then you've got this other thing here, the depth of the follicles, and they can vary from 2 to 4. The upper lip's only 1 millimeter deep. Armpits and bikini hair is quite deep, 3.5 to 4.5, 5 millimeters. The scalp hair is really deep; it can go down to 7 millimeters apparently. So there's a big variation not only in the duration of all these phases, anagen and telogen. There's also a big variation in terms of the depth, and this actually makes it even more difficult, because what we have to think about is, well, when's the best time to treat these things, and how much energy? Because this depth thing here, the depth follicle, is an indicator of how much energy we need to apply at the skin surface. Because if you don't apply enough, you're not going to get down to these depths, 3.5, 4, 5 millimeters. If you can't get the energy down there, treatment's not going to work. Simple as that. Whereas for the upper lip, some of these follicles are only 1 millimeter deep, so they're really quite superficial. So we have to consider this and the anagen, intelligent, and catagen phases to try and figure out the best times and the best energies. It really is a minefield. I gotta say, it's tricky stuff. So what's the best time between treatments? I get asked this all the time. The best time is when you got to leave enough time so that most of the follicles come back in the anagen phase. There's no point treating somebody after a couple of weeks where there's only a small number of anagen follicles, because you're kind of wasting your time. So you got to leave a bit longer so that most of the follicles are back in anagen. So when is that? Okay, so I've done some analysis on this, and it turned my hair white. Honestly, before I did this, my hair was jet black, as some of the ladies know there, and now it's gone white because it's so confusing. Here we go. This is bizarre stuff. So on the chin, let's say we do a treatment today. Okay, so the first treatment you do today, this afternoon. On the chin, the second treatment should be 4 weeks later. The third treatment you can do any time after. So you can do 2 weeks, 4 weeks, 6 weeks. It doesn't matter, because of the way the chin hairs are growing. 81% are an anagen at any one time, which means almost every time you treat, there's tons and tons in anagen, always. And the upper lip, after today, you need to wait 8 weeks. Same with the armpits. Bikini 7, you could do 8 if you wanted to. And legs, 8 weeks. For the arms, you'd have to wait a little bit longer, 12 weeks, because of the cycle. Then after that, it gets kind of confusing. And this is confusing. So for the upper lip, you wait 8 weeks after the first treatment. And then for the third treatment, 2 to 4 weeks later is actually a good time, which makes no sense at all. For the armpits, 4 to 12. Bikini, 6 to 10. You know, the legs, 14 to 16 weeks. And at this point, you're sitting going, this guy's bonkers. What's he on? What's his meds? And I'd have to agree with you. It is bonkers. But I've been looking at this for the last 4 months or so, trying to work this out, and it's confusing as hell. But this is the data that I'm finding, because the problem is the way that hair growth cycles work is just really confusing. It's not at all obvious, and it doesn't seem to make any sense. But these are the times that I'm finding are the best times. The second treatment after the first treatment, that's quite straightforward. That's easy to predict. After that, the whole system becomes kind of quite chaotic in terms of timing, and it just becomes really strange, and to try and figure out these times. So this is what I'm saying at the moment. This might change, once I get some better medication, and I might get a better idea. But for the moment, we'll go with these figures. And I am doing some tests on this. On my legs, so I'll let you know how that goes. I do all these tests on myself. So SHR, super hair removal, we all heard about this. This is supposed to be the best way to treat now, and it's pain-free and all the rest of it. Some people call it in motion. You tend to find that more with the diode systems for some reason. But the problem with this is it's very difficult to apply, or to apply correctly. That it is quite tricky. The reality is you can get really patchy results, and most people I've spoken to have said, yeah, I get some good results in some places and some poor results in other places, and it's hard to gauge why. As for pain-free, well, that's quite subjective. So the way this works is, imagine you're firing a whole bunch of shots like this. So these are all pulses on the skin. It can be diode or IPL, it doesn't really matter. Well, the way it works is, if you're scanning across the skin back and forth like this, at the two ends, you're slowing down, stopping, and then reversing. So at the two ends, you're firing shots on top of shots like this. So you get a bit of over treatment. But in the middle, you're sweeping through like this. So in the middle, you can easily miss areas. Really easy to miss. You get big patches in the middle there where there's no shots at all. So you get very patchy results. If you were a robot, you could set this up beautifully, and you say, okay, robot, we're doing this and this at that speed. Here's the area, off you go. And the robot could do it perfectly, but we're not a robot. Well, I'm not. I don't know you guys, but I'm not a robot. So this is really, really tricky stuff. Now, some people do say, they swear to me that, yeah, I get great results. Yeah, you maybe do, but you probably have to do a lot of treatments and kind of cross your fingers and hope, I suspect. It's not a very logical way to do these treatments. It just isn't, unfortunately. So why do people get poor results? Well, quite often it's because of a low fluence, that they just not set the machine up properly, so the temperature's too low. Quite often the pulses are too short, so you're not getting enough cooking time. Sometimes the technique's just poor, so it's patchy, like we saw a minute ago. Poor cooling, so it's painful, it's blistering, could lead to scarring if it's really poor. The choice of targets, some people I'm hearing are trying to treat blonde hairs and red hairs and having really bad results because it just doesn't work very well. Or the skin's too dark when you're getting epidermal damage. So all these can lead to poor results, unfortunately. Other things that we need to consider, I can't do it today because I just don't have enough time today, but we should really talk about diode and long pulse shag lasers, which are used for darker skinned people, and for a good reason, because they cause less damage in the epidermis. Proper cooling techniques. I haven't really described properly how to apply cooling. There is a specific technique that, a specific technique which is really good. How do you choose the fluence in different body areas? As you saw a minute ago, the follicles are all at different depths. So you have to allow for that. You can't use the same fluence on the upper lip as you would, for example, on the armpits. You're not going to get the same consistent results. What are the clinical endpoints? I see lots of people saying things like, oh, you see lots of swelling, lots of reddening, hairs popping out, and all kinds of stuff. And some of that's just rubbish. Test patches. You need to do test patches, otherwise insurance companies don't like it. Safety. Haven't mentioned safety of your eyes. Got to make sure you get the right glasses, etc. And then there's some new ideas coming along, which hopefully will improve things. And I'm working with some guys at the moment, a company, to hopefully come up with something new, which will make this much easier and better results. In the last during lockdown, I teamed up with a friend of mine, Swedish guy I've been working with for a couple of decades, Piranha, and we've started to write these books, or chapters of these books. So these are now available free online as a PDF, as online books. They've got videos and links to websites and what have you. The first chapter is just the fundamentals of machines and IPLs. The second chapter is about tattoo removal, and I'm working on the third chapter, which is hair removal, curiously enough. That hopefully will come out sometime before the end of the century. I'm not quite sure about yet. So later this year, I'm going to put together a masterclass. I'm going to come down south into Englandshire at some point. I'm going to choose somewhere, hopefully central, and we're going to talk about laser hair removal, IPL hair removal in more detail. I'm going to talk about laser tattoo removal, and then how to treat blood vessels and pigmentation, also with lasers and IPLs. And if you're interested in coming to one of these masterclasses, then please send me an email, and we'll try and get something organized. I'm thinking that we're going to do this probably about August, I think. Right, so thank you for that. That was a fairly quick summary, just under an hour. We've got, you can have a look at my blog. You can see there, I write all kinds of bits and pieces onto that routinely to try and explain things. And you can have a look at my website there also if you wanted to see what sort of courses I do. I do training courses and a whole bunch of stuff. So what I was going to suggest now is we can have a wee chat if you like. So if anybody wants to ask a question, give me 2 minutes because I'm bursting for a pee. So let me do that first. You know what men are like. I've been sitting here drinking ginger and honey and all that because I've got a cold, as you can hear. So give me 2 minutes to go for a pee, and then we can have a wee chat afterwards, okay?